morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start, may I take this time to remind everyone of our house rules and reminders for today's event. To our participants, please kindly mute your microphone when not speaking to avoid disruptive noises. To mute your microphone, you can select the microphone icon at the bottom left corner of the Zoom call. And when the icon has a red slash through it, that means that it is muted. During the Q&A, please use the Q&A chat box function and type your questions briefly and clearly. Questions given during the registration have been collated, and we will be discussing those, raising those points to the speakers later on. To facilitate an open discussion, Chatham House rules will be observed. Participants are free to use the information from the discussion, but should not disclose who made any particular comment. Participants are also requested to virtually remain in the webinar until the end. And we would like to remind you that the webinar will be recorded for internal documentation. Participants are not allowed to do so. If you have any concerns or inquiries, you may direct them to the technical assistance of the webinar via private chat. Lastly, please continue to observe proper decorum throughout the sessions. The organizers, FES Philippines, Facts Asia, and the Foundation for the National Interest strive to ensure a high level of security for your personal data. The organizers will comply with the Philippines Data Privacy Act, governing data that was gathered as part of the registration process during the event and the evaluation. With that, we can now formally open our event. I wish everybody a good and pleasant morning. Welcome to the pilot episode of European Foreign and Security Policy in the Indo-Pacific webinar series, where we will focus on great power rivalry and the role of middle powers. It is a pleasure to see all of you here. My name is Charmaine Willoughby, an Associate Professor of International Studies at De La Salle University in Manila, and I will be your host and moderator for today's program. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Philippines, Facts Asia, and the Foundation for the National Interest. Dr. Vincent Huzel, Resident Representative of FES Philippines, will now deliver his pre-recorded welcoming remarks.
Dear partners, friends, honored speakers, and participants, welcome to our web talk on great power rivalry and the role of middle powers. First of all, I have to apologize for not being able to attend in person. Due to a last-minute change of schedule, I am forced to record my greeting in advance. I'm very sorry, because I would have liked to follow this discussion in person. The discussion and analysis of the geopolitical situation, especially in Asia, is a central topic for us at the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung as a German-based political foundation. We are very grateful to have partners in the Foundation for National Interests and Facts Asia who share this concern with us and who make this activity possible today. Thank you very much for that. With its growing economy, its resources and its population structure, the Indo-Pacific is an important, if not the most important region for economic and security cooperation. In addition, most trade routes pass through the region. Given the interdependence of the economies of the EU and Indo-Pacific regions and the uncertainties caused by the pandemic and the climate crisis, it is important to strengthen strategic cooperation and strengthen the rules-based international order in the region. Therefore, there is a need to better understand and explain EU policies and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. This comes against the backdrop of the ongoing war in the Ukraine, the economic recovery from the pandemic, tensions in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, climate change, and the broader implications of digitalizations, particularly the use of artificial intelligence. We are grateful to the FNI for taking this initiative to bring experts together and provide a space for learning and dialogue. It should be about how the strategic cooperation of the EU has a better effect in the Indo-Pacific region. As a partner institution, we as FES support venues for dialogue like this one to consider the perspectives of different experts and stakeholders on important policy measures. We hope that this first webinar and the next webinars to come will contribute to that. Accordingly, I wish you all an exciting and instructive discussion. Thank you very much, Maraming Salamat, and with that, I give back to our esteemed moderator, Charmaine. Thank you.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Vincenz. Indeed, the European Union is geographically distant from the Indo-Pacific region and has initially viewed our region through an economic lens. The bloc particularly has a policy of engagement with Beijing and enjoys robust trade with Asian states. However, China's growing economic and military assertiveness and its growing strategic rivalry with the US prompted the EU to reevaluate how it views the Indo-Pacific. In today's webinar, we aim to examine how the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy will impact the growing geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. As a new player in the Indo-Pacific, we also aim to examine how the EU can forward its goal to maintain a rules-based multilateral order with middle powers in the region. We have three esteemed speakers who will be given 20 minutes each to discuss their views and insights on European foreign and security policy, great power rivalry, and the role of middle powers. Now, let's start to delve into this very relevant discussion as I introduce our first speaker for today's webinar, Ms. Laura Hassanen. Ms. Hassanen is the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Finland in Manila. She's a professional in EU foreign policy and international development with work experience from the UN economic and social sector. She has worked in various duties in international affairs for over 10 years. Laura, the virtual mic is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well and see me as well. Thank you very much to the Foundation for National Interest, Fax Asia, and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for inviting me to speak in this really interesting webinar and the first of many interesting webinars on this topic on the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific, and it's really an honor to speak in a group of such experts. So I hope I will be able to, in 20 minutes, give you an overview of what the EU has been doing in the region since the release of its Indo-Pacific strategy a couple of years ago. I will begin my presentation by introducing the strategy from 2021 and provide some concrete accomplishments in the cooperation since then. Then I'll sort of look at the EU's role in the region and its cooperation with other players, its position in relation to the great powers, and how EU member states, also smaller ones like Finland, my country, can have an active role in the Indo-Pacific. In the end, I thought I would briefly discuss the increased presence of another organization, namely NATO, in the region. That's something quite new, and also almost all EU member states, Finland as well now since a couple of months ago, are members of NATO. But first, on the EU and its Indo-Pacific strategy. So as most of you know, the strategy was released in the fall of 2021, so about 2 years ago. So as was already mentioned in the beginning, in the introductions, the Indo-Pacific region has increasing strategic significance for Europe, and its growing economic, demographic, and political weight makes it an essential partner in shaping the international order and addressing global challenges. The EU has intended to increase engagement with the Indo-Pacific for building partnerships, also to lay foundations for rapid recovery from the pandemic, as was already mentioned. And this engagement is really based on promoting democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as the Paris Agreement on climate change. So a quick look at why the EU is placing increasing amounts of interest on the Indo-Pacific. So obviously our futures and our economies are interlinked, as was mentioned. And this is why the EU and the Indo-Pacific countries are natural partners, firstly in trade and investment. The EU is a top investor, top development aid provider, and one of the biggest trading partners in the region. Together, the EU and the Indo-Pacific account for over 70% of trade in global trade in goods and services, and over 60% of foreign direct investment flows. The trade exchanges between Europe and the Indo-Pacific are higher than between any other regions in the world. And the Indo-Pacific obviously also hosts major waterways that are integral to EU trade. Climate change is a key issue, so the EU has taken seriously into account all the risks and challenges related to that. In the Indo-Pacific, also its rich biodiversity. So the region is vital for mitigating climate change and protecting the planet's ecological balance. And with regard to geopolitical dynamics, there has been increased displays of force and tensions in the Indo-Pacific's regional hotspots like South and East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And the EU realizes that these tensions may have a direct impact also on European security, which obviously increases our interest to monitor the situation closely. The region's stability can also be seen at risk from the pressure of authoritarian regimes put on democratic principles and human rights. So all these factors mean that it's essential that the EU reinforces cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners and promotes the rules-based international order, as well as access to open markets, including a stable trade environment. Also, through green and digital transitions, this engagement should contribute to Europe's strategic reach and security, and to securing the resilience of supply chains. Obviously, the EU will remain a consistent defender of human rights and democracy also in the Indo-Pacific. It will focus on supporting the rights of women and girls in inclusive policymaking, and the voices of civil society, the private sector, social partners, and other key stakeholders. So I thought that I would next walk you through the 7 priority areas of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, and mentioning a few concrete successes for each area, which were highlighted in the latest EU Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum in Stockholm in May this year. This is a bit of a list, so bear with me, but I hope that this will provide an overview of what the EU wishes to achieve in the region. The first priority the EU has in the Indo-Pacific is sustainable and inclusive prosperity. And it's really looking into ways to build back better after the COVID-19 pandemic. It includes building resilient and diversified value chains, value chains through trade agreements, responsible business conduct, and supporting a green socio-economic recovery. So the EU has really worked on several tracks to play its part in securing global economic recovery. In the region, the EU has signed partnership and cooperation agreements with Malaysia and Thailand in 2022. And several Pacific states have notified of their interest to join the EU-Pacific Economic Partnership Agreement. Negotiations with New Zealand on a free trade agreement were concluded successfully last year. And negotiations have been ongoing with several other countries, noting especially the relaunch of FTA negotiations with India and Thailand. And obviously, several countries enjoy trade benefits from the Generalized Scheme of Preferences, the GSP Plus system, including the Philippines. The second priority the EU has is on green transition. So EU action in the region is based on long-term plans to cooperate with partners in the fight against climate change and to counter biodiversity loss and other environmental degradation. And a key way to move in this direction is through circular economy, something that many European states are really experts on and focusing on, including my country, Finland. The EU has taken a variety of actions to advance sustainable, safe, and affordable energy systems in the region. It has launched several so-called Team Europe initiatives. So these are programs that are pooling all EU actors together, including EU institutions and member states and the private sector. So many of these type of initiatives to support the transition to a green economy in the Indo-Pacific. A couple of examples, the Green Blue Alliance for the Pacific to build hydroelectric dams and seaports in Fiji and Kiribati, and a Green Team Europe initiative with ASEAN. Also initiatives in green transition or the energy domain with several African and Asian countries. Priority number 3 is ocean governance. So the EU is taking forward action to strengthen this area in the Indo-Pacific in full compliance with international law, obviously in particular UNCLOS, with the main objective to ensure the sustainable management of the ocean's resources and safeguarding biodiversity. So far, EU's concrete actions in this field include negotiation efforts in the UN to reach an agreement on the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction treaty. The European Union has also been supporting Indo-Pacific partners in the fight against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The fourth priority the EU has in the region is on digital partnerships. So they really are there to develop technical, policy, and research cooperation with partners on infrastructure, digital transformation of business and public services, and skills development. Also with a view of facilitating digital trade. The EU has been building a network of digital partnerships with Japan, the Republic of Korea. These were launched in 2022, and with Singapore since 2023. Here in the Philippines, the Digital Connectivity Global Gateway Initiative will support digital transformation. I'll speak a bit more about EU's Global Gateway strategy later. The fifth priority the EU has is on connectivity, which is obviously a very, very important and current topic. So the EU is helping partners put in place a regulatory and policy environment to attract private and public investment on connectivity. The EU is involved in several connectivity projects in the Indo-Pacific, also through deepening engagement with key partners like Japan and India. The EU and ASEAN have reaffirmed in 2022 their joint commitment to promote connectivity with the launch of a Sustainable Connectivity Global Gateway Initiative. So sixth, I will talk about security and defense. So the EU promotes an open and rules-based regional security architecture, including secure sea lines of communication, capacity building, and enhanced naval presence in the Indo-Pacific. The EU has sought to establish tailored partnerships in this field by conducting regular security and defense consultations and dialogues. For example, the EU's Atalanta operation has successfully concluded joint naval exercises with partners like Indonesia, the Republic of Korea, Japan, Oman, and the United States. The EU and Japan signed an agreement for cooperation on anti-piracy in 2023. Another example of EU's work is the Crimea project, which has offered capacity building activities and information sharing solutions to more than 20 countries in the Indo-Pacific. So finally, to conclude my list, the EU seventh priority in the Indo-Pacific is on human security. So this includes issues like health and disaster risk reduction, humanitarian assistance, which EU has proven its capacity to swiftly provide assistance in disaster-struck regions, for example, in Myanmar. The EU's Copernicus Emergency Management Service technology has been used in several natural disasters in the region, including in the Philippines last year. Also, the EU has confirmed its support to health systems in the Indo-Pacific. One example is the 10 million euro support to the Asia Investment Facility for a technical assistance program in Indonesia's health sector. So I hope this sort of gave an overview of what the EU is doing and that it is an active player in the Indo-Pacific, but how does it position itself, especially in relation to other actors in the region, and how do others sort of see the EU? So in the Indo-Pacific region, the EU will aim to deepen its engagement with partners that already have Indo-Pacific approaches of their own, like the United States, but also ASEAN, Australia, India, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. With China, the EU will pursue a sort of multifaceted engagement. It will engage bilaterally to promote solutions to common challenges. With China, cooperating on issues of common interest and encouraging China to play its part in a peaceful Indo-Pacific region. But at the same time, the EU will work together with partners who share similar concerns to protect its essential interests and values where fundamental disagreements exist with China, for example, on human rights. The EU is a strong supporter of the centrality of ASEAN, with which it has a very dynamic partnership. This strategic partnership covers political, security, economic, environmental, climate, and also socio-cultural issues, as well as connectivity, which I spoke about earlier. So the EU values very highly the ASEAN's commitment to effective multilateralism and its efforts to build a rules-based regional architecture. EU-ASEAN cooperation also covers security issues. The United States shares this idea with the EU, the idea of ASEAN centrality, and the EU and US have also obviously discussed Indo-Pacific issues several times and affirmed their shared goal to coordinate on Indo-Pacific engagement and identified possible priority areas and themes for cooperation, which include climate change, public health, including pandemic response and preparedness, freedom of navigation and maritime security, human rights, labor standards, good governance, infrastructure, critical and emerging technology, cybersecurity, and countering disinformation. So a very wide selection of areas where the EU can cooperate with the United States in the Indo-Pacific. So the EU is very keen on working together with other actors in the region and not really positioning itself in that sense against anyone. I think it's fair to say that the EU is not necessarily the most well-known partner for countries in the Indo-Pacific. But I certainly hope that the strategy from 2021 and the work of the EU special envoy for the Indo-Pacific in the region will continue to helping changing this. And sort of push the EU to work more strategically and really increase its presence at the EU and its member state gateway strategy. So boost smart, clean, and secure link, and to strengthen health, education. So the global gateway is based on investment gap worldwide. Between 2021 and 2027, Team Europe, which means the EU institutions and the EU member states jointly, they will mobilize up to 300 billion euros of investments for sustainable and high quality projects, taking into account the needs of partner countries and ensuring lasting benefits. So the idea is really to allow EU's partners to develop their societies and economies, but also to create opportunities for the EU member states private sector to invest and remain competitive. And obviously, the idea is to increase EU's presence globally, but in this case, in the Indo-Pacific. So, for example, in the Philippines, there will be two global gateway initiatives. One is on digital connectivity, and the other one is on green transition. So, very important issues. So, on the latter, on green transition, the focus will be on improved circular waste economy and climate change policies, and reduce GHG emissions. Also, enhance practices of circular waste economy by the local government units in cooperation with the private sector and the civil society, really focusing on youth and gender equality as well. The idea is to have private and financial sectors engaged in innovation and plastic waste reduction solutions, climate change mitigation measures, skills and green jobs, and allowing youth and women to thrive in a circular economy. For the digital connectivity initiative, the focus is still being discussed, but a major component should be the sort of use of EU satellite technology, as in the already ongoing project on EU's Copernicus Capacity Support Action Program for the Philippines, which is worth about 10 million euros. So like I said, the idea is really to, with Global Gateway, to increase EU's role and visibility in the region in a way that is mutually beneficial to both EU, its member states, our private sector, and our partner countries. And my country, Finland, as well, is keen on participating in Global Gateway initiatives, also in Asia, in many ways, through our companies, as well as hopefully government as well. So earlier I mentioned that the security situation in the Indo-Pacific can have effects on the security in Europe, but obviously this works both ways. So I should point out that the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy was written before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So it doesn't take the changing security environment in Europe into account, really. But obviously the developments in Europe since the beginning of last year are felt also in the Indo-Pacific, as we live in a world of shared security. Russia's illegal invasion is felt through, for example, hikes in food and energy prices. And really the EU and the Indo-Pacific region, we have a common interest in addressing these challenges and upholding the UN Charter and international law. So Russia's invasion was a turning point for my country, Finland, as well. We made the historical decision to join NATO and have been members since April this year. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of raise on the table the fact that NATO is also strengthening its presence in the Indo-Pacific and relations with its partners in the region, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. And this is really an important aspect of the NATO 2030 agenda. The North Atlantic Council meets regularly with the partners in the Indo-Pacific. They're addressing topics like security situation in the Korean Peninsula, maritime security, and climate change as well. NATO allies also meet with them in military formats. So this type of political dialogue ensures that NATO and its partners can enhance situational awareness on security developments in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions, including issues like cyber defense and climate change. So I think it's safe to say that obviously China is the key reason why NATO is looking increasingly at this direction. And NATO has openly declared China as a security challenge. And China has made statements like warning against NATO-like military alliances in the Asia Pacific and saying they are exaggerating conflict in the region. So I think this is a very interesting thing to keep an eye on in the future. So my country, Finland, has a new government and a new government program since a couple of weeks ago. So it's clear that we are strengthening also because of our NATO membership, our cooperation with the United States, but with also other major like-minded partners. Our relationship with China will ultimately be defined through the European Union and NATO. We are also systematically reducing any unhealthy economic dependencies with China. So it remains to be seen what my country's policy towards the Indo-Pacific will be. Regardless of that, we will continue strong engagement in the region through the wide palette of actions the EU has taken on in the Indo-Pacific. I think that is really, I think that is EU's strength in the Indo-Pacific, the fact that it's really actively engaging in all these different sectors and finding partnerships with other players in the region as well as all the Indo-Pacific countries. So not focusing solely on, for example, security issues. So definitely, I hope that the EU will further strengthen its cooperation with the Indo-Pacific, both politically, economically, and in the defense sector, because the strategic importance of the region is really too big for the EU to waste. So thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to the next speakers and presentations and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for discussing the EU's priority areas in the Indo-Pacific and Finland's experience since joining NATO. Indeed, we have converging interests, which can be fertile ground for furthering cooperation. We now move on to our second speaker, Professor Alice Ba. Professor Ba is an associate chair and professor of international relations and comparative politics at the University of Delaware. Her work on the international relations of East and Southeast Asia focuses on the structures and processes of regionalism and regional integration, cooperative regime building, and the asymmetric relations and strategies of smaller and major powers. Alice, the virtual floor is now yours.
I thank you very much. Can you hear me? Great. So I'm going to take a bit of a more conceptual approach. I'm not an expert on Europe. So I'm going to take a more conceptual approach to the concept of middle powers, and also the significance that they have at times of great power rivalry and uncertainty, as the current moment is. And then I'll follow with some additional points specifically about European states as middle powers and the context in which they're operating. So I'll start with the question of conceptualization, right? I mean, one of the questions that I was on the list that I was asked to address was, what are middle powers? And there's quite a lot of debate about middle powers, both about their conceptualization as well as their relevance. You know, those looking at middle powers tend to highlight a few key attributes: their relative power, their relative autonomy in the international system, the scope of their effects, as well as their behavior. Defining middle powers in terms of relative power and autonomy are relatively straightforward, right? I mean, if you look at various power rankings, for example, there's a pretty big gap between, like superpowers, China and the United States, on a whole wide range of issues. And then we have a cluster of middle powers that are considerably more capable than many small powers, right? And so that's a pretty straightforward conceptualization, this middle kind of ranking. Hugh White, an influential Australian academic, puts it this way: that this population of medium-sized states are generally better positioned to resist external power pressures from larger powers. They're also better able to assert positions of their own. And this last point is, of course, one point that I'm going to emphasize. But they're also better able to assert positions of their own, that is, positions forged independently of the great powers. Similarly, Mark Beeson and Richard Higgett conclude, another set of scholars that have worked on middle powers, concludes that there are clearly limits to what middle powers can do, but they do have options, right? If, right, as they put it, if they choose to exercise them in the right areas. I want to emphasize here that middle powers are not a new phenomenon, but it is worth noting a few features that distinguish 21st century middle powers from those of the past, and they have relevance, again, in terms of what we're seeing today. First, middle power capacity in the 21st century is really more about economics, or it has been about economic power. Middle powers in today's world politics, compared to those in the past, are distinguished by their economies, their non-traditional security agendas, and less so for their military prowess. Second, there are more of them, right? And also more that self-identify as middle powers. Middle powers in the 21st century are also more heterogeneous as a group, right? And we can categorize them we can group them in two categories. And again, this has particular bearing on today's discussion, right? On European powers in the Indo-Pacific. So those categories, as some have characterized it, are established middle powers, right? Or what Edward Jordan refers to as traditional middle powers. And then the second group that are constituted by emerging or non-traditional middle powers, right? And the role of emerging powers may be an especially notable distinction in today's politics. Established powers are constituted primarily by European powers. I think we can also add here Australia and Canada to this group. These states are, again, referring to Jordan's work, they're relatively wealthy, relatively stable, relatively socially democratic and liberal. Established middle powers also enjoy a greater degree of status and recognition that is institutionalized in their bilateral relations with larger and smaller powers, and also in their international roles, for example, in global governance institutions. To put it simply, right, this first set of powers tends to be more status quo, right, in ways that our second and newer and less traditional set of middle powers, the emerging powers, are not. On each of these points, in fact, the second group of non-traditional middle powers contrasts with the European ones, right? They enjoy weaker international standing. They're relatively less wealthy. They have greater basic developmental needs. They are generally more authoritarian economically and politically. And just as importantly, again, for this discussion, I think that these two categories capture well some key variations among today's middle powers globally and key variations in the specific case of the region in question, right? Namely the Indo-Pacific. And this includes some contrasts in terms of responses to the US-China rivalry. And then finally, a third distinction between today's middle powers and past middle powers is that, what has been the liberal world order has provided expanded opportunity and platforms for middle powers to influence, right? And as we've already heard, I think, and at the last presentation, I think illustrated this very well, that contemporary middle powers are especially associated with multilateralism, with diplomacy, and in general, non-military pathways of influence. Middle powers have played also entrepreneurial roles in developing international norms. And they've also been associated with, focused or specialized activism, right? And this might be in specific functional areas, or it might be specialized in a particular part of the world, for example. Again, we can cite some of the, there's a body of literature now on the middle powers. And, another study by Andrew Cooper, Richard Higgett, and Kim Nosal see middle powers distinguished by, quote, their tendency to pursue multilateral solutions to international problems, their tendency to embrace compromised positions in international disputes, and their tendency to embrace notions of good international citizenship to guide their diplomacy. Right now, of course, in a time of change, right, all these things are also in flux, but in general, these are the things that have been associated with middle powers. Recent discussions also highlight the roles of Japan and Australia, right, in influencing first the U.S. rebalance policies under Obama, and now the content of Indo-Pacific strategies under President Trump, and now under President Biden in the United States. Middle powers can have special significance at times of changing geopolitics, as we are seeing today. There is a relatively robust, sizable, and varied population of middle powers. And that robust population, I would maintain, is what distinguishes today's great power rivalry, right? These middle powers in the context of today's great power rivalry from the past. It's a question, one question we have, given this population of middle powers, one question that has been of debate in some quarters is, how do we conceive the current world, right? Is it a multipolar world, right? One prominent, as some of you are aware, this a prominent Singaporean diplomat, Bilahari Kasikan, has characterized the world as an asymmetric multipolar world, right? Asymmetric meaning that it refers to the great asymmetries between those two superpowers and the rest, but also the fact that there are all these many middle powers that also are not without some influence. And abilities to also assert, right, different kinds of positions. We can also talk about, again, the variations among these middle powers. And so while it may be the case that for example, for European middle powers, that their inclination will be to lean in with the United States, it may not be the case for some other middle powers that may either be more ambivalent, more conflicted, more concerned, or in some cases also leaning China. Right. So again, this diversity of middle powers, this sizable population of middle powers, I think is important at this time of great power rivalry, this US-China rivalry, and it does distinguish, I think, this moment from some past periods. Discussions on middle powers also highlight how middle powers tend to be more active at times of greater uncertainty. Right? It's easier, not put another way, it's easier to coast when great powers are stable and relations are stable, right? And so some have also highlighted how middle powers can take on more active roles in times of great power uncertainty. Right? Times of great power rivalry confront middle powers with certain choices. They can be active supporters of one great power or another. They can serve as neutral third parties. They can serve as system maintainers. And they can also perform more entrepreneurial roles in carving out non-great power options, right? And I highlight these different kinds of roles and choices because in discussions about US-China rivalry today, the choice is too often characterized as in simply great power-centric terms, basically as states having to choose between the United States and China. Okay, but in fact, there are different roles that states can play. And middle powers are maybe in a special position to do so, right? Middle power conceptualizations, right? To view it from middle power conceptualizations is to highlight, again, a different kind of choice rather than thinking about either the United States or China. We might think in potentially more or a potentially more interesting way to think about that choice confronting middle powers may be, as middle powers being in a position to offer alternative framings, alternative problem solving, and different options. In other words, do they choose to play, right, in essentially two power, two option game, or do they also play roles in expanding what that world looks like and the kinds of options available to them, right? Whether it's to sustain certain arrangements, whether it's to bridge certain choices, to facilitate, right, compromise, or again, also to push certain norms and rules and ideas, right, forward in terms of what the current moment looks like. Among states of the Indo-Pacific, we see both responses from middle powers, right? In the Indo-Pacific, for example, I would argue, and our next speaker, may have different ideas, but I would argue that us, and I think many would agree, but Australia, middle power, from that first category of established middle powers, has chosen the first choice. That is to play a more active and strengthened supporter role to the United States. If we were to go further south, or not further south relative to Australia, but at least further south in terms of the global south, Indonesia, a middle power from the second category of emerging middle powers. Indonesia has been working through ASEAN, pushing for non-US centric, non-China centric options and alternatives. And one commonly cited example is Indonesia's push for, an ASEAN alternative conception to the Indo-Pacific, right? Namely, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And, the AOIP, right? The ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific might also be considered an example of how states have used diplomacy and soft power to influence the powers that are larger and more capable than they are, right? I mean, so one of the questions that was asked of me to address was the question of soft power and diplomacy. And so this might be one of them. And there's no doubt that, an important critique is that, well, this may be simply lip service on the parts of other powers. But the fact of the matter is that it is part of the discourse, right? And states do respond to it, they do cite it, and it becomes something that also frames an important part of the discussion and the debate to make it about also other powers in the system. Right. And so ASEAN has continued to push and support frameworks that both sustain opportunities for great power dialogue and also their own needs, right? States in Southeast Asia, their own needs to maintain relations with all. Right. And so this is what states might also call, the role in playing, maintaining a pragmatic dynamic equilibrium, right? To quote, Indonesian officials. We can also talk about Japan, and I do want to kind of mention Japan here, right? Japan fits less neatly, I would argue, in the two categories that I've just described. And the difficulty of categorizing Japan may also help to explain, I think Japan's sometimes complicated response, I think, to the US-China rivalry. On the one hand, Japan, like Australia, has been the leading middle power in the region to kind of to increase their active supporter role of the United States. Japan, like Australia, has also expanded its burden sharing responsibilities. But Japan is also interesting in that it's also actively sought to expand US attention beyond larger powers and larger middle powers to other states. It has also maintained participation in regional integration initiatives, including those that don't include the United States. It has also sought to expand the content of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, right, beyond military, right? And it has sought to outreach to states of not just Southeast Asia, but also broadly of the global South. And so in more than one respect, one could also argue that while Japan has played, as a middle power in the context of this great power rivalry, has played an important role as a supporter country of one of those great powers over the other. There's also been an argument to be made that Japan has also played an important bridging role in another respect, right? At least in terms of different kinds of powers in the international system. Turning to the European middle powers, which is the focus, of course, of this webinar, again, as I mentioned, middle powers can be grouped into two categories. The European powers mostly defining the population of established middle powers. And there are 3 points about European middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, that we might mention. The first is the one that I've already cited, which are differences in capacity and in standing. And this does make them more important, potentially more influential, right, as middle powers, vis-a-vis the superpowers, vis-a-vis the United States and China, compared to some other middle powers in the system. The second is the fact that European and middle powers are not geographically in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is also an important point, right, in terms of what their interests are, in terms of how other states perceive their role. And so it is an important point that European middle powers are not of the Indo-Pacific. The third regards legacies of colonialism, which can be sources of networks and influence, to be sure, but they can also be reasons for resistance, questions also on the parts of those former colonial powers in the Indo-Pacific, right? And so again, these points mean that European middle powers, on the one hand, may be better positioned to influence the two rivals, especially the United States, but on the other hand, right, a more activist regional role in the Pacific can also be more contentious, right, or at least more debated. When thinking about, European middle powers in the Pacific, I think there are questions, right? And not all see it as a foregone, right, good, right? Especially when we're talking about kind of security contributions, right? The NATO question, I think, of course, is now a subject of debate and discussion, right? As a new development in the Indo-Pacific. Right. I thought I'd just share just a few comments, right? Charmaine and I participated at a workshop last week involving, speakers from, the 10 Southeast Asian states. And I took a little bit of an informal poll, knowing that I would be presenting today at this panel about their thoughts about Europeans' middle powers in the Indo-Pacific. And I thought, one comment, gets at, I think, the distinctions between the different middle powers. One answer that was repeated was a kind of get serious, right? And get serious is meant in two respects, right? One in a not so flattering way, and one in a very positive, engaging way, right? The more negative way was that it was get serious in the sense of, the immediate response on some that I asked was to refer to what they felt were hypocrisy, double standards, lecturing on the parts of European powers towards Southeast Asian states. Right? They saw the question of European middle powers as those in Europe coming in to lecture Southeast Asian states on how best to stand up to China, for example, right? How best to run programs, how best to run their states. And so that's an important concern. Several were also, and I know some may want to forget about it, but some were also very quick to refer to, of course, the speech that was made by Joseph Borrell last October, right? As an example of that kind of thinking, right? Where he characterized Europe as a gardener, as the garden where everything works. And elsewhere as the jungle that needed to be fixed and pruned. And so I'm not going to belabor that point, but I do cite it as a way to kind of think about the distinctions and some of the complexities of a European role here. The second meaning of get serious, as I said, is more positive and more embracing, right? And more welcoming of a European role. And that is about to get serious about the things that Europe, at least Southeast Asian states, right? Because I was only talking to those that were speaking, about views on Southeast Asia. And that was to get serious about doing what Europeans do best, right? Capacity building, trade relations, right? The trade relations and economic relations, extremely important. And I think many of those areas that was cited by the last speaker, I think, speak to those points, right? A green economy, sustainability, expanding trade options, right? So that states in the region are better able, for example, to resist pressures from great powers, to carve out, right, different options, so that they're not forced into one position or another. So I am going to leave it at that, and allow for our next speaker, and which I also very much look forward to her comments.
Thank you very much, Alice. Conceptualizing middle powers is very important for our discussion today because it helps us grapple with the range of movement that we have in the midst of great power competition. So we now welcome our third speaker, Professor Caitlin Byrne. Professor Byrne is the Pro Vice Chancellor Business at Griffith University, where she provides strategic oversight to the Griffith Business School, an institution globally recognized for the responsible business and public policy leadership in education, research, and engagement. A former diplomat and more recently having led the Griffith Asia Institute, she's recognized as one of Australia's leading academic practitioners with a focus on diplomatic practice. Caitlin holds a range of advisory board roles, including to the Australian government's Sports Diplomacy Advisory Council. In 2020, Caitlin was made Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs for her contribution to international education and Australia's engagement in the Asia-Pacific. Caitlin, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. Can I check, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fabulous. Really just so lovely. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to follow on from Laura and Alice. And Alice, I have to say I'm such an admirer of your work. So it's a real privilege for me to be sitting alongside you on this virtual platform, and of course a huge admirer of the work and energy that Charmaine brings to the discussion of international relations in our Indo-Pacific region, and to all of the team at FACS. Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I might begin actually just with a bit of Australian protocol. Normally when we meet in Australia, we would recognise the traditional custodians of the land, and I'm joining you from Brisbane, and where the traditional landholders are the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, and I pay my respects to all First Nations peoples right across the widest reaches of this virtual platform. I have to say I'm coming into this conversation thinking probably more with my practitioner hat on, and thinking in some ways about this real conundrum that middle powers often find themselves in terms of working out who they are, how they behave, and how they represent themselves on the global stage, in particular during a time of great power rivalry. And Alice, I thought it was really telling that you spoke about how quite often middle powers are free to coast. You know, there's not a great deal of pressure on them, but in times of rivalry and strategic competition, that changes. And middle powers do perhaps have to think a little bit about the kind of choices that they're making, the behaviours that they're exhibiting, and how they're engaging with other middle powers, with great powers, to really actively shape the world in which they find themselves. I'd like to actually begin with some of that conceptualization around the notion of middle powership, because it's been quite a dominant feature in Australian discourse and in the Australian experience about its place and pursuit of place, particularly in the Asia Indo-Pacific region. And it's a funny thing that when we think about middle powers, it's almost like really being stuck in the middle between the significantly stronger powers in the world and the minor powers, where you still can't buy or bully your way in the world, as former head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia, Peter Varghese, would say, but where you do have some capacity to influence, but it's influence through different measures. And middle powers will each view their own middle powership quite differently. And I think thinking about some of the categorizations that Alice gave us is really important. For Australia, I think it is quite true that the notion of middle powership does offer a potential to be active and engaged in the world. And I'll come back to this a little bit more. For others, like Korea, it's sometimes about denoting a specific positioning in the world, the shrimp between two whales, sometimes the dolphin between two whales. Andrew Carter has recently written in particular about the Australian experience, but thinking more broadly about middle powers, where he speaks to the three factors that underpin the status of middle powers: their position, their behaviour, and their identity. Speaking to Australia from that first perspective, position, if we think about economy, population, military size, and the proportion of GDP spent on defence, we can conclude, fairly resoundingly that Australia generally meets what is required to be a middle power. We are anywhere between the 12th and 14th economy in the world, depending on the time at which you're looking at the stats. We tend to have around about the 13th or 14th highest global military spending in the world. It's really only when we come to population that Australia sits substantially outside the field with a significantly smaller population than many others. But generally, when it comes to the positional definition, most Australian scholars and practitioners would see Australia as falling quite neatly into that middle powership issue. And it's quite interesting that it's a unique view on middle powership, and particularly when concerns around population and scarcity of population vis-a-vis land size are raised. Quite often, it's not so much notions of power, but notions of powerlessness that come into the way that Australia thinks of itself as a middle power. But perhaps that fits more in behaviour and identity. When we think about behaviour, Australia has embraced a very strong, active middle power behavioural approach, right from the time of a post-Second World War timeframe. Australia has sought to be an active player on the global stage, coining the term middle power to really represent its diplomatic efforts from the time of the conference in San Francisco, where Foreign Minister Doc Evatt at the time sought to represent the views of small and middle power nations, through to Gareth Evans speaking to the notion of being a good international citizen in the 1990s, through to more recent behaviours with under Kevin Rudd, and more recently under the current Prime Minister Albanese. The key issue here is that Australia as a middle power has really sought to encourage cooperation and to prevent conflict. The degree to which it has been successful in that is up for debate, and generally there's limited evidence that supports some of that behavioural ambition of middle powers, but nonetheless there is an active engagement. Australia in its Foreign Policy Statement of 2017 defines that engagement as being a regional power with global interests and wanting to be involved in coalition building and consensus building across a range of security and defence, economic and other issues. And the third feature relates to identity. And I wanted to speak here a little bit about the Australian position again, because Australia has claimed its middle power status fairly consistently across all political leanings, from the time of Foreign Minister Evatt in the 1940s through again to current Prime Minister Albanese. And there have been some ups and downs in that, and some resistance to the idea that middle powership might be selling our status too small, and some political leaders preferring to call Australia a significant or pivotal power. Nonetheless, there's been a general consistency in the way that Australia has seen its own identity as being one of middle powership, an active power that seeks to play an active role in shaping the world around it. And that identity piece has been really closely linked as well to values. Again, the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper makes explicit reference to Australia's national values, values around being a successful multicultural democracy, a democracy in which the rights of the individual are seen as paramount, where tolerance across a whole range of issues, gender, religion, race, are also at the forefront of discourse. That these actually set the foundations for Australia's success in the world. And they also determine how Australia might work with others, whether and how they are applied, including in the construction of strategic narratives, I think is something that remains insufficiently unpacked. And it's something I'm really interested in. I know others in this fora have spent a great deal of time looking at. But nonetheless, there is a strong sense of identity, of middle powership being at the core of an Australian identity, its construction of an identity, its construction and projection of strategic narratives, and in how it seeks to shape a free and open Indo-Pacific with other like-mindeds in today's world. And the reason I wanted to talk around some of the Australian perspective is because every middle power is going to bring its own unique perspective into the world. And I think before we get to the question around whether and how do middle powers cooperate, it is worth understanding that each middle power will bring their own unique perspective, and that perspective will be shaped by their respective contexts and their characteristics, and will determine to what degree and who they might cooperate with. Certainly, there's a sense that middle powers together, working together, can advance their respective and collective interests in a way that speaks to a larger ambition and potentially creates a larger outcome. Cooperation for middle powers can be a force multiplier, particularly where there is a clear convergence of interests. And we've seen that in Australia's case, whether you look at Australia's engagement in the non-proliferation agenda through to building coalitions for outcomes on agricultural tariffs, for example, through the Cairns grouping. But it can also be a drag, and I think we've got to be really careful that we don't lump all middle powers together, as Alice has already mentioned, potentially where those interests are not convergent, or where there are differences of perspective that haven't been fully unpacked or reconciled, or where identities might be misaligned. It's not clear that cooperation is the best way forward. Australia's middle powership cooperation has manifested itself typically through consensus and coalition building, where narrative becomes really important and quite central to drawing others to the table, the soft power element of, or the power of convening others to the table. Multilateralism has been a key commitment for the Australian perspective. And whilst not always a consistent commitment to good international citizenship, certainly a consistent commitment in political rhetoric, at least, to responsible international citizenship. And we've seen this more frequently in recent years through the strategic narrative advanced around a free and open Indo-Pacific that actually upholds a liberal international order. So the instinct of Australia's middle power diplomacy has been evident through a range of activities, through its peacekeeping and humanitarian interventions from Cambodia to East Timor to the Solomons, to a range of trade reforms, to chemical and biological export controls, to the advocacy on particular issues like nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. and through other collective security initiatives. But it can also be quite roundly criticised, and there are a number of scholars who would criticise Australia's active middle powership, including through cooperative efforts, as sometimes presenting itself with a moral superiority. Again, picking up on the idea that sometimes Australia has, whether willingly or unwillingly, taken on the moniker, or knowingly or unknowingly taken on the moniker of being this kind of deputy sheriff for the United States in the region. So there are some real tensions at play in the way that Australia has manifested its middle powership through various cooperative mechanisms. I was asked to talk a little bit about, you know, the role of multilateralism, and I think that for middle powers, certainly for Australia, multilateralism does sit at the heart of its ability to cooperate and its ability to shape agendas, to project and influence narratives, and to advocate certain positions and certainly advanced policy positions. But I think we are seeing the fact that minilateralism offers a more attractive prospect for middle powers today. It is seen by policymakers as offering a more accessible route to cooperation, being more agile, and potentially offering a greater opportunity to be responsive to the dynamics of a really volatile and contested international order. In the Indo-Pacific, for Australia, the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Forum remain central. But I think, again, here, understanding the dynamics at play, particularly within the ASEAN grouping, is absolutely critical to the success of middle powers like Australia and others, including from the EU, in engaging through these forums, understanding what ASEAN powers mean by their own ASEAN centrality, for example, and supporting notions of ASEAN centrality when and how it's understood, I think becomes an important part of the dynamics of cooperation and certainly the dynamics of dialogue. But there are other opportunities here for cooperation and particularly focusing on some of those minilateral opportunities. The G20, for example, is an increasing mechanism that offers a substantive policy agenda, particularly focused on economic governance, but increasingly is addressing a range of other issues and not only bringing foreign policy ministers and leaders to the table, but also bringing a wider group of constituents to the table, whether that's through think tanks in the T20, business and business leaders through the B20, civil society leaders through fora such as the W20. The G20 has been an important mechanism, although many view it as simply no more than a talk fest, but an important mechanism nonetheless for dialogue, and dialogue that breaches global north, global south barriers in some respects and brings a very diverse group to the table. Middle powers like Australia and those from the EU should be thinking and do think about how they can work collectively through the G20 to shape agendas, to bring others from our Indo-Pacific region into the conversations and to represent a wider diversity of views. Other examples, of course, are mechanisms, though less formal, like the Quad, the security dialogue that reflects the engagement between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Again, the Quad represents Australia's view of working with so-called like-mindeds. It has offered a great deal of policy attraction in terms of also bringing the US to the table and giving a middle power like Australia a different kind of heft in the international community. And the Quad has become important in addressing a range of issues, not just traditional security issues, but also issues around climate change and climate action, disaster recovery, supply chains, and managing issues around critical technologies. These are all increasingly important issues on our security agenda and are deserving of greater attention. Now, the Quad brings its own challenges, there is a sense of like-mindedness, but dig a little bit deeper under the surface and that like-mindedness starts to fray, or that sense of like-mindedness starts to fray. And there are certainly differences of perspective. And we've seen those differences come to the fore, in particular with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and India's standing on questions around the Russia issue. There have been, of course, as well, opportunities for middle powers to experiment in how they come together. The Quad, is in some ways an example of experimentation, kicking off several years ago, actually in the wake of the 2004 tsunami. It wasn't necessarily obvious that the Quad would be a successful grouping. It's much later, and certainly in response to the rise of a more aggressive China, that the Quad has found its successful footing and moved from officials to leaders, to a leaders dialogue. It does offer the opportunity to think about where others might come into the conversation, particularly Korea and Japan, for example. There are other examples of experimentation in this space as well, MICTA being one of them, the grouping, an informal collaboration that brought Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia together. It was announced as an informal grouping in 2013 and was seen to be a recognition amongst these middle powers of their shared democratic values, open and similar-sized economies, and the opportunity that each brought for a more constructive role, both within their regions and on the global stage. Now, I think MICTA, while it signalled an intent for different middle powers to work together informally and to find common ground and pursue common interests, particularly around a range of issues like global governance, cybersecurity, food and energy security, it hasn't necessarily taken hold because that convergence of interests and that sense of like-mindedness in terms of identity formation hasn't necessarily found its strong footing. I wanted to come a little bit to the point that Alice made around the notion that middle powers like Australia may have taken a more active stance, but have also been faced with how they might make different choices in a more contested environment. And I think this came to the fore earlier this year when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese presented at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. In his speech, Anthony Albanese certainly made a strong reference to Australia's long-standing tradition of middle powership and the fact that that represented Australia's ambition to really see middle powers and smaller nations have a seat at the table to be able to make their contribution to collective security. And it really reinforced Australia's commitment to a rules-based order where might does not necessarily dictate the outcomes of that order. But for all his emphasis on the role of small and middle powers, I think it became clear that Anthony Albanese was also signalling that Australia stood very closely with its great power friend, the United States. And he made the point that for as long as Australia has made our own foreign policy, our alliance with the United States has been central to it. At first glance, that statement was fairly unremarkable, but for many commentators in this space, it does signal the fact that Australia's choice really is to be aligned with the great power, the United States. Now, that's not going to be the same right across the Indo-Pacific region, and it brings some other tensions to the fore. And that's where dialogue becomes increasingly important, again, to just ensure that there is an understanding of these different perspectives. Just very finally, before I wrap up, if I can speak very briefly to the issue around technological and military advancements in the region. And we know that increasingly there is an emphasis on new technologies that are shaping, new technologies and investments that are shaping a new era, potentially, of military cooperation in our own region. The AUKUS agreement, or the AUKUS partnership between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, announced in 2021, is perhaps an example of this. And again, for Australia, this is a signal that it's looking to the heft of great powers to boost its own positioning and its own sense of place in the region. The first pillar of the AUKUS agreement is focused on the acquisition and development of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy. Now, that's created quite a bit of controversy back here in Australia. It's certainly generated some disquiet in the region. I think the Philippines being one of the only ASEAN nations to come out very clearly in support of the AUKUS agreement, but that wasn't the case right across the region. I'm going to put the submarine piece to the side for a second because it's a fairly long-term strategy that will see that will bring British design and American technology together with Australian input to produce a range of submarines that will not be delivered before the 2040s. So it's a long-term strategy that at the moment seems a little bit abstract for many in the Australian, certainly in the Australian population. But it is around the pillar 2 that I think we start to see the significance of this kind of grouping, where the 3 countries have agreed to collaborate on developing advanced capabilities that are going to involve a broad range of technologies and information sharing, really driven by this increased geopolitical competition and in particular by China's investment in its own military technology. So it does aim to boost the development and interoperability across a range of technologies, including robotic and AI technologies. Again, I think this is an area where access to research and development becomes important, where investment in R&D becomes a game changer for middle powers, and building opportunities for sharing and learning from each other. Right across this spectrum of quantum technologies, of AI, of advanced cyber capabilities, of hypersonics, of electronic warfare. All of these elements are going to define the success of Australia's middle powership going forward. And I think they're going to become new features of a different kind of power contest in our own region. Already we've seen Pillar 2, this technology exchange part of AUKUS, make notable progress. Military and civil personnel from across the 3 countries are already cooperating in a range of exchanges and interchanges that are increasingly important for building capability in this space. But I think this is also where the opportunity to work together with like-minded partners from the EU becomes important. And Australia and the EU already have a range of opportunities for cooperation across our political relations, including how we think about our strategic narratives for the region, in economic relations, including through our free trade agreements, and in foreign and security policy. I guess if I would perhaps come to an end, I think there's a great deal that's going to be important for middle powers, bringing their diverse perspectives together in this region to share perspectives and to learn from each other and to think about where their interests converge, where there are commonalities in their ambitions for the kind of regional order we want to see and the kind of global order we want to see, for greater cooperation that will amplify and advance not just our individual interests, but collective interests. And I think there's a great deal more dialogue that we need to have in terms of how we set that vision and how we speak to the ambition and the narrative of that vision going forward, and making that very real and concrete for a wider audience becomes quite critical. Anyway, I will finish there. Thank you so much, Charmaine, and look forward to the discussion from here.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, for giving us the Australian perspective. It's so interesting, at least for me as an academic, to find the variations in being a middle power, in that its definition and expression is really contingent on that middle power's unique historical and geopolitical circumstances. Thanks as well for highlighting the importance of minilateral arrangements as a possible platform or mechanism for furthering and deepening cooperation. Before we proceed to our open forum, I also wish to thank all our speakers this morning, Laura, Alice, and Caitlin, who shared their insights, expertise, and invaluable time. For our participants, you may post your questions in the Q&A chat box. We have collated some of the questions from the registration, and I'd like to start, privilege of the moderator, I'd like to start really with this issue of choice, particularly of binary choices that always seem to hang over the heads of middle powers. Why do you think this narrative of choosing between the US and China seems so prevalent? Perhaps I can start with Laura on this score to give us the perspective of the EU and Finland and how that choice was made even more stark with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So perhaps, Laura, you can start the ball rolling for our Q&A.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting question, and I wanted to actually first start with saying it's interesting how the I spoke about the European Union, and then I started thinking, listening to the other really interesting presentations. The ladies often referred to the European countries as middle powers, and then I started thinking, is the EU a middle power? Because I think that's a very general challenge for the EU also here in the Indo-Pacific, that it's sort of the role it has, it's very difficult maybe to sort of comprehend, and often it's easier to cooperate with the individual countries. So I don't really know if in sense of making the sort of binary choice between the US and China for middle powers, if the EU obviously it's a balancing act. We all have our very delicate economic dependencies also with China, all EU member states. So that's it's a difficult balancing act for the European Union, who speaks on behalf of the member states and for each individual member state. But obviously the illegal invasion of Russia in Ukraine, I think it was evident that the sort of we all wanted to sort of stand in the right side of history, and we really supported our partner countries in Southeast Asia to really look at the facts and the implications that the war could have also in this region, and think about that when they're making choices, for example, in how they vote in the United Nations for on resolutions regarding Russia's illegal invasion. So that definitely, I think that was a push for all of us to really look at how we work together with the great powers in terms of also in terms of the dependencies that we have. And like I said, Finland has really acknowledged the fact that we need to look at how we work with China and look for different partnerships as well and different solutions. And that was obviously what happened with Russia and all the countries in Europe. We really realized how dependent we can be on our larger neighbors, and for example on energy, we really had to revamp our systems entirely. So I think that's something that all middle powers, but especially small countries, really need to look at the larger picture and sort of be prepared for whatever may happen, and really sort of diversify the options. that we have. Thanks.
Right. Thanks so much for that. Because as a small or middle power like the Philippines, for instance, we always get this question of, which one would we choose? Or some of the narratives that have emerged would be, the choice has been made because we signed an alliance treaty with the United States, but there are a lot of nuances to making that choice. I would like now to turn to Alice, because you brought up really, really rich conceptualizations about being a middle power. But what do you think would be the possible measures to maybe regulate or minimize the negative effects of the rivalry to Southeast Asian countries? I know that we discussed this extensively in KL last week, but if you can bring some of what we have discussed then to our forum today, just to enrich today's discussion as well.
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. I mean, I think obviously I'm interested in hearing your thoughts as well, I think, on this question. I think obviously this is something that all the states are kind of grappling with, and, mitigating, the rivalry in Southeast Asia. I think states have one important approach is to maintain relations with both, right? I mean, and you see I would argue that if you look at what both individual states have done as well as collectively, I think that there's an interesting choreography that is taking place in the region as a way to kind of mediate the perception on either side, right, that somehow they're losing in the region. And so, you see these overtures with the United States, and then you'll see something with China, right? You'll see something with China, you'll see something in the United States. And that's not to say that these things are exactly the same or that they're exactly comparable, right? But I think that kind of dual engagement, and often kind of choreographed to follow one another, I think is a very interesting kind of way to at least mediate some of those effects. I mean, I don't know whether that was your question, but that's certainly one way I think I see states trying to respond, to the situation that's presented them. That may not be, I may have misunderstood your question though.
I think that's a good way to kind of push the envelope forward, and it builds up to the other questions that I'm starting to receive right now. My next question is for Caitlin. You mentioned minilateral arrangements, and the Quad is a very good example of that. But there have also been emerging discussions about trilateral, or furthering the Quad to include Quad plus other countries. Do you think that would be a potential for deepening the cooperation between, for instance, Australia and the Philippines? And what do you think are some of the strategic areas where our two countries can collaborate?
Thanks so much, Charmaine. And if I can just also add a little bit to the previous question, one of the things I think that is so important is the framing of choice, and that binary between China, US, it's so problematic for so many reasons. I think our foreign minister has been really careful to tone down some of the previous rhetoric that we had seen from Australia around that choice, that binary choice. Because we have to cooperate with China where we can, as she would say, and we also have to disagree where we must. And I think the framing now has become much more about what does the vision for our region look like? What does a rules-based order for the Indo-Pacific look like? And that, in many ways, allows us to mediate a little bit between our strategic and defense considerations and our economic considerations and those broader political issues. So I think there's so much more nuance. It's a wonderfully provocative kind of conversation to have around choice, but really unpacking the many threads that sit there, and actually that it's got so much more to do about the kind of region we want to be a part of, that can help us navigate some of that. But just going to the Quad, yes, there has been so much talk about a Quad plus. I was recently in Japan, where there was a great deal of discussion, not just on Japan's interest in being a part of the Quad, but also Japan's interest in being a part of AUKUS. Some talking about JAUKUS as the next iteration with Japan at the table. Korea too has been thinking, has been involved in various dialogues, particularly Track 1.5 dialogues. But I think there are going to be opportunities for various alignments that sit around that Quad grouping that are going to see others like Vietnam, New Zealand, Brazil, South Korea, Philippines as well become quite critical partners. I am continually surprised that the Australia-Philippines relationship, as you know, does not get more attention. We have seen our partnership shift into a strategic, comprehensive partnership, but we don't talk about it enough, and it doesn't get enough attention because, as we know, as allies of the United States with very similar interests in key areas around maritime security, counterterrorism, and with a proven track record of cooperation in key areas and deep people-to-people links, we should see so much more activity happening between Australia and the Philippines. And I would suggest that Australia could play a more active role. Now, I say this as someone who has the luxury of sitting outside the policy circles at the moment, but from a university perspective, I think we should be doing much more together. I think there's a role for Australia to really bring countries like the Philippines more closely into our dialogues that are occurring around and within that Quad grouping. So I think the opportunities are there. The attention just hasn't necessarily been there. And I think that's something that we need to continue to place emphasis on.
I completely agree with you that the Philippine-Australia relationship is not getting, the spotlight that it deserves. But we are moving closer and closer to deepening our partnership, and I'm sure that in due time, the efforts that we're doing will also gain traction and gain the attention. There's another question here that is very close to my heart because I'm also studying this phenomenon, and this is about information campaigns. Based on your research, your experiences, have middle powers actually fared better in fighting disinformation? So I would like to hear the perspective of Australia, of the EU and Finland, and from an academic perspective, how do we grapple with these competing narratives in social media and in public discourse? So perhaps I can start with Alice in this sense, give us an academic framework of understanding this phenomenon.
Well, it's not my area of study, so I'm not sure I can offer an academic or scholarly take. I think I can only offer my personal observation, which is that I think it's very difficult, right? I think it is very difficult. I mean, I'll use the US as an example, right? I mean, especially as, democracies or democratic states, it's actually quite difficult to regulate, I think, or to crack down on, information, right? And so I think this may not be exactly what you're talking about, but I do think it's very difficult.
I agree with you. Totally difficult. I've spent maybe 2 years of my life trying to study this phenomenon, and I don't think we're anywhere near.
Tell us,
right? Anywhere near just learning and knowing all the parameters. But based on the EU's perspective, I know that there have been a lot of efforts and initiatives to address this problem. So maybe you can share with us, Laura, what the EU has done and what Finland has done in particular as well.
Yeah, thank you. I can't speak for the European Union. I'm actually not fully aware what concrete sort of initiatives have been taken at the EU level. But in Finland, I mean, certainly due to our neighbor in the east, we're a target of disinformation to a large extent, and it's something that we take very seriously, and something that we do have a lot of expertise in. Not me personally, but we have a lot of experts in this field, and also we really do a lot of focus on media literacy a lot, since we are already at kindergarten. So it's something that even very young children are sort of taught how to interpret different kind of information and the sources, and it's obviously more and more important in the age of social media that we live in. And it's something that we've spoken a lot about in the Philippines. Obviously, Facebook is a huge thing, people, and I think that the fight against disinformation is something that hopefully we can support as the European Union, but also Finland, to provide any assistance in this as we can. And I think it was also made very clear after Russia's invasion how the sort of flood of disinformation was hugely evident, and it's an insane struggle, and feels impossible to fight against it. But you know, we're doing our best. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. I really think, and I do appreciate that that Finland has really been engaged a lot in media literacy programs, and involved in educating the youth about, you know, what constitutes correct information, accurate information, and all that. I'd also be interested to hear from Caitlin what Australia has done to fight information, or to combat information campaigns, you know, in your country.
Thank you, Charmaine. And it's been really interesting to have seen the level of investment, particularly in countering mis and disinformation, rise, and the shifting focus within government agencies, including the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to thinking about more strategic communications. I think it's a real issue, and Alice has touched on this already. The nature of our media environment and landscape is just, as a democracy, it's never going to be a controlled environment, and so managing mis and disinformation becomes a much greater task, and a task that has to be diffused through various actors. What I would say, and I've found this quite interesting, I was interested in how Australia and Japan in particular were using social media within the Southeast Asian region vis-a-vis China. And Australia and Japan, as examples, were leaders in setting up Facebook accounts, in presenting, you know, in working through public groupings to present messages. But they've been really behind the 8 ball in terms of their communications has been really very much about fairly superficial kind of destination marketing almost, you know, come to Australia and study or think about this. Whereas China, I think, whilst it's been a latecomer to the use of social media, has invested heavily, is very targeted in the way that it engages with strategic publics, whether through political connections or friendship groups, or through scholarships and diaspora communities, and has just been has been much cleverer in and sophisticated in the use of messaging. So I think that there is much to be learned. Of course, this is not an easy space, and it does require significant investment, and it's a long-term project. So for countries like Australia that work on a 3-year electoral cycle, and where diplomacy does not feature highly in the budget discussions, this is an area that I think we have to see more investment and concentration into.
Thanks, Caitlin. Now, time is running out, but we have time for one round of questions, and I have 3 for each of our participants. For Laura, Finland's history with great powers is well known. What can countries like the Philippines learn from Finland in how to deal with great powers? For Alice, my question is the term Global South, do you think this is still tenable or relevant, given that middle powers are not necessarily Western countries? And then for Caitlin, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has recently said that a reset with China is not possible. What is Australia's approach to a more assertive China? So I think those 3 questions would be would help us, kind of bring the discussion full circle. So maybe I can start this last round with Laura, some lessons for the Philippines on how to deal with great powers.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so definitely we have a long history of living next to a very large and powerful and unpredictable neighbor. During the Cold War, our policy was very much due to our president, who stood in office for about 30 years. So we were very much leaning towards the East. The policy even got its own name, Finlandization. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we started to look more towards the West and really look to multilateralism and cooperation. And since we joined the European Union in 1995, we definitely haven't been impartial anymore. So we've been member of the group of European countries, and since a couple of months ago, we ended our long-term policy of military non-alignment. So now we're also members of NATO. So I think with Russia, our policy for a long time was really to be the sort of Russia whisperer. So we knew how to speak with them, and we were, the experts, and we wanted to remain very careful, even after the Cold War. It was definitely a sensitive issue and kind of like a generational trauma, one could say, on how to deal with Russia. But like our president said, once the Ukraine invasion by Russia happened, masks went off, and the true faces of the leaders were seen, and it was like a wake-up call for us in terms of what anything can happen, and these great powers don't necessarily think as strategically as we might like to think. They can also act quite quickly, and their actions are not necessarily based on sort of strategic and long-term visions. So I think what we've learned is that multilateralism, international cooperation, rules-based international order, those are the things that we have been basing our policies on, and our actions, and even more so now as members of NATO. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Those are really important lessons for the Philippines to take into consideration, keeping on engaging with the international community and never turning our back. Thank you for that. For Alice, the question on the Global South, please.
Sure, that's a great question. I think, as some of us are aware, how to categorize, the populations of states right, is kind of a difficult enterprise, right? I mean, and this notion of the global South can certainly be contested as well, right? I do think it still captures something, right? I'm not sure what the right term is, but I do think it captures something about kind of non-core powers, maybe. That's one way to kind of think about it, perhaps. Maybe it's still not a perfect term. But I do think it captures something about status, something about, where they sit in the hierarchy. But I think it's a great question in terms of how best to conceptualize or to call, right, a pretty diverse population of states, right? Again, just as in middle powers, there's a wide diversity of states. The other thing that I would say is that, I don't think it's necessarily in contradiction, for example, with middle powers. Right. And this gets at, I think, the point that, Caitlin, as well as Charmaine, were making earlier. I think, as I think we've all been trying to highlight, there's a wide variation amongst the middle powers, and middle powers are distinguished. I think, Caitlin put it probably best, by their own, national experiences, identities, narratives, right? And I think that the notion of the global South and the identification, right, with the quote global South is also one of those distinguishing things, right? I mean, in terms of thinking about some of the differences between the middle powers as well, right? Like Indonesia's, again, approach, right, might be more reflective of that, compared to, like, let's say, South Korea, actually, right? So that's where I would kind of come in on that, but it's a great question.
Thanks, Alice. As academics, we understand that even the labels that we use to describe reality, they themselves evolve over time. So you're absolutely right. It still captures something, but it looks like we're moving towards something else to capture the reality of the experiences of these countries. And then finally, for Caitlin, the question on Australia-China relations.
Thank you. And I'd have to agree, language is just so important. I know I referred to global North and global South with the G20 example, and it really is, and I thought as I was saying that, there's so much more to that is quite loaded. Language and how we think about the diversity now is incredibly important. But language does matter. And the question was around Penny Wong as our foreign minister, making the point that there's not going to be a reset in the relationship with China. I think Penny Wong has been incredibly careful in the way she has used language, particularly in relation to the Australia-China relationship. So in terms of no reset, that means no turn back to the way the relationship was 15 years ago, where perhaps we were able to separate those interests around the economic relationship we had with China versus the potential for strategic competition. The way that the relationship is framed today has been much more around stabilization. And again, a word that I think has been chosen carefully, not a normalization, but a stabilization. And we have seen, since the Albanese government has come in just over a year ago into power in Australia, the restoration of diplomatic engagement, which had broken down in under the previous government's term, the restoration of diplomatic dialogue, both between leaders and foreign ministers, but there remain a number of differences on the table, not least, the fact that there are a couple of Australians that are detained in China, and Australia has been very forthright in seeking a resolution in both of those cases, but also the longer term impact that we've seen of economic sanctions on Australian goods. Now, some of that is changing, but I think what Foreign Minister Wong has been very keen to do has been to maintain a very realistic view of what the relationship looks like, and the fact that Australia-China, there is a different relationship at play today. And the key consideration is how we are realistic about and open about differences, and how we navigate the differences that are at play in the relationship. But I think there is an opportunity here for more constructive and positive dialogue with China going forward, and potentially looking at opportunities to cooperate where that is possible, but to be very open about where the differences mean that that's not possible.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Now, before we formally end, may I ask our three speakers to pause for a bit for a photo? We in Fax Asia are so stoked and so honored to hold this all-female panel and talk about security that we really need a photo for it. So Florence, please let us know when you're ready.
One, two, three.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. On behalf of Fax Asia, FES Philippines, and the Foundation for the National Interest, we wish to express our warm gratitude to our speakers, Caitlin, Laura, and Alice, and all our participants for a very fruitful discussion. We hope to see you all again in our future webinars. If you have questions or concerns, you can reach us via our official Facebook and LinkedIn accounts. And before we end, may we also ask for a few minutes of your time to please answer the post-event survey in the attached link in our chat box, or scan the QR code that's being flashed to you right now. Those who require a certificate of attendance, please be informed that you would need to accomplish this evaluation survey to get your certificate. Once again, this is Charmaine Willoughby. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat po. Thank you so much once again, Caitlin, Alice, and Laura. Have a great day. Hope to see you all again soon.
Well, thank you. And hopefully I'll get to meet you sometime soon, Caitlin.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye-bye.